Well, anyway, this is rather different than what you've been seeing, I'm sure. I've seen a number of the talks. And what we're going to do is just kind of pull back for a second and reflect on an approach that was developed by Amartya Sen, which is just a very subtle way of thinking about well-being. It's so subtle that even people who work in it don't really know what's going on with it. And constantly morphing into new ways of thinking about things. And that's exactly what Sen intended. The capability approach was not meant to be something that was given in a formula, everyone learns, you memorize it, you go out, you run a regression, you're home. It was meant to be part of a process of thinking and introspection on what constitutes the good, what constitutes well-being. And as well to challenge other people's notions of the good, including economists who like to talk about welfare economics. Come on in, guys. It's all right? Great. Now, this is a very interesting equilibrium where everyone jumps in at the same time. So it must have been a travel-based equilibrium. So I'll back off for a second while they sit down. I don't want to. Thank you for that. I appreciate that invitation, and I will. Oh, it's so good. Okay, so here's the motivation. What is well-being? How about that for a question? What's the right space in which we should be evaluating the inequalities that we're all concerned with here? Sen's answer is functionings. These are the beings and the doings that we all value. And then he added a very strange phrase, and have reason to value. Having reason to value is, I mean, it perplexed me. When I reviewed one of his books and for a publisher, I said, this having reason to value, I just don't know what the heck it's all about. Turned out that he was trying to say that if you reflected on this, and if many people reflected on it, they would see that indeed what you value, there is reason to value. So it isn't like going out and killing babies. Oh, I value killing babies. If you reflect on that, and others do, you may not sustain your belief, your value of killing babies. That's the idea. Okay. Secondly, capabilities. It's the collection of functionings that are available to people. So we have these functionings that are these beings and doings, and then we have alternatively sets of functionings. And it's those sets of functionings that Sen really focuses on in his capability approach. So let's have some examples of functions. Being adequately nourished, which I'm on the margin of right now. Being free of avoidable disease, I really don't know. I haven't been to my doctor yet. I'm a little bit fearful. Having the ability to take part in society or in the kind of affairs of the neighborhood, the people down the block, the life of the community. Then having self-respect. These are beings and doings. If I could represent each one of them, and if you look at them, they're very much 0-1 in most of the times when he's talking about capabilities and functioning. There are a lot of 0-1 type of ideas. There's not necessarily continuous. But if they were continuous, then you could take this discussion and convert it into a graph that looks almost, it's remarkably similar to traditional economics. One of the reasons we put it in the book. And there we have functioning 1, measured continuously, functioning 2, measured continuously, and some kind of a frontier. And on that frontier, we imagine that people have values, and therefore there's an indifference curve reflecting their equal valued pairs of functionings. And a choice is made. In this case, the choice is being made by maximizing that which you value. So here we have a choice occurring, and the choice, let's say, is the achieved functioning of the person in question. So capability set is K. It goes by the name either capability set or opportunity set or capability. And the point x, the vector, is a vector of functionings. So there's two entries in the vector. Question?
I feel like, and maybe if I'm wrong, this is kind of implying that there's a trade-off between the two functionings, right? Like,
Well, I mean, there very well could be a trade-off.
You can't have full health and full participation.
In this picture, yes.
Okay.
It could be square, in which case there's no trade-off.
Okay. Yeah.
Right? We just drew it like this to make it so that it would be intuitive to people to realize that you could actually envision this same thing, this in the same way as you do most of economics. Note this distinction between functionings and capabilities. Capabilities are the sets. They're the freedom to choose these valuable alternatives based on how big the set is, okay? And that's independent of whatever that little curve for the value was all about, right? Right. Functionings reflect not what could be, but what is. Okay, so what you choose, the achieved functioning, is indeed what you see and what you get. It's the current achievements of the person in question. Now, this may have something to say about other alternatives, but very often doesn't. If you see an achieved functioning, you may not know what the other potential functionings were that the person didn't choose. So that's the big question in the implementation of this, is how to go from an observed functioning to an unobserved set or capability set of opportunities or capability set. The big difference between these two is, in terms of the best example, I think, is fasting and starving. In that case, we have two functionings that look pretty much the same. But they differ substantially in terms of well-being, in terms of evaluation of situation, because the person who chooses not to eat is very different in their well-being than someone who is forced not to eat. It's that difference between having the ability to eat and not to have the ability, which is the distinction between these two ideas. Sure.
That last thing that you said suggests something different from I think a lot of economics in that
Yep.
capability set A is maybe more important than the that you're actually end up at other economic.
Exactly. So economics, indirect utility. I mean, the choice is all that matters, the utility from the choice. How are we going to judge a state of affairs, except in that way? So this is a radical departure. There are some people who took the step before and other people who have taken steps since. David Krebs has a great paper in which he describes a way of thinking about going beyond the choice and looking at sets of choices as having value. That value might come from flexibility and an options value that's probably very important to this very room. That's the kind of intuition that you do see in economics, but which isn't in the sort of mainstream choice theoretic model that we tend to look at. Good point.
James,
Yeah.
the issue of reasonable desires.
It may, but if you want to talk about it now, I think it's a fine time to talk. I will be talking about it a bit, but yeah, we can. Okay, let's continue. All right. Could I have a little help on this thing? I prefer to be, I prefer to have a good look at what's going on over here, and that's better. Because that way I don't have to remember if I'm remembering what I'm supposed to be doing. Food's just making its way into my system. I think I'm doing much better. The other side of Sen's approach, and what's really interesting, is this concentration on separating out the ends of the whole equation, the ends of development, the ends of human development, the ends of what we consider to be important for evaluation, and the means to achieve those ends. Functionings and capabilities are both means and ends. Each is desirable for them in themselves. As we said, we have value for these functionings, but they could also be instrumental for other ends. They don't have to be by themselves and independent. They can be very interactive. And it's at that point that we start getting into the interesting discussion of how does education impact health? How are these dimensions so importantly related? Obviously, being healthy is an end in itself, but it also helps you achieve a lot of other things, including earning income. Social interaction is an end in itself. It's fun, it's enjoyable, but the social interaction may lead to other things that are also in themselves valued. Now, wait a minute. This is nice talk, but why don't we just go ahead and use income to evaluate well-being and call it quits? It's easy to understand. It's easy to measure. Single dimensional, which is one of the big problems in this sort of area, is that you have so many multidimensional things, so many things running around, you can hardly keep track enough to aggregate it into an indicator that makes sense to people. It's comparable across people, right? Isn't income yeah. I have my dollar bills, you have your dollar bills. We compare and we could switch, in fact. They're entirely comparable across people. Right? And it underlies most evaluations of well-being, right? If you look at most economics, this is what's looked at. And it's fungible and very policy relevant. You can make transfers. Sen's answer, of course, is that no, income is a means, not an end, and quotes Aristotle in saying, the life of money making is one undertaken under compulsion, and wealth is evidently not the good we're seeking, for it is merely useful and for the sake of something else. The conversion of means to ends varies dramatically across people and groups of persons as well, and that's the key reason. No, that dollar is not necessarily the same for you as for me. I may need more because I'm disabled. Just to achieve the same ends, the same things you might be doing, it may take a heck of a lot more for me to achieve them. So the real opportunities, and I'll read this from our book, the real opportunities that different people enjoy are very substantially influenced by variations of individual circumstances. Age, disability, proneness to illness, special talents, gender, maternity, and also by disparities in the natural and social environment, epidemiological conditions, the extent of pollution, the prevalence of local crime. Under these circumstances, an exclusive concentration on inequalities in the income distribution can't be adequate for understanding of economic inequality. So goodbye to the anonymity axiom of income inequality comparisons. You have to know those other dimensions and the characteristics of people in other dimensions in order to make an appropriate evaluation of inequality. And hello, multidimensional analysis. A multidimensional analysis of inequality, which by the way is very hard, of poverty, and of well-being. Well, wait. Why not utility? Utility makes sense. It's, something we talk about all the time. Why can't we just aggregate it up to a social welfare function and call it quits? Why don't we just compare utility levels? And the answer is, well, typically utility is not measurable. It's not something you see. I don't care what people say. The numbers they call utility are a result of something else. There's no basis, even if you could find identical utility functions for two different people, there is no reason why those two people's utility levels should be at all comparable. You're subject to all kinds of problems such as adaptation. Adaptation means that my utility is very sensitive to small changes toward the good because I'm in such a terrible situation. And so what looks really bad to you and is really bad to you and is really bad to me, looks good to me, and I report it as looking good to me. So I don't know why I put this quote from, that's to say if you got a cold, take a shot of malaria. Anyone from knowing Bob Dylan from the old days, this is the John Birch Paranoid Blues. You know, I've had malaria so long that a cold looks good. That's the idea. So in particular, what happens is that you have examples of particularly gender-related issues where women are restating their base points in conjunction with what they're expected to restate and what they've been experiencing over time. So utility? Maybe not. Well, why not the commodity bundle or the budget set? Well, again, the means, not, you know, the ends. It's still subject to really huge variations across the conversion functions. However, if you look at the bundle and the budget set, it's a very nice analog to the functioning and the capability set. So it's a good way of thinking about capability as an, just to keep it in your mind, but it's very different. There may be other reasons for using functionings and capabilities. Many key functionings look like stocks or are almost stocks, so they stick around a while. And consequently, they can be influenced by current conditions, but they stick around and represent what's been going on for a long time before. You have the past investments feeding into your current state. And so it may be, in fact, more predictive of the future. And we've seen this in multidimensional poverty analysis using dimensions that correspond to capabilities, that the power of being able to pull out who is chronically income poor, it's stronger with multidimensional measures that are based on a capability approach than by using just income itself. And this is particularly true for kids, which obviously don't have any market-based outcomes yet. The pre-distribution set, I think, is what we would call this group of people. And one could argue that this is really the newest shape of welfare economics. The old welfare economics, there was a new welfare economics, there was a new welfare economics, and this is multiples of new welfare economics. It's regularly invoked by all the people who you would want to listen to in these sorts of issues. Although Sen really regarded the capability approach first as a framework for thought, as I mentioned before, a way of conceptualizing well-being and other things. And second, as a critique of the standard ways we do stuff. And only third, as a way of making interpersonal welfare or inequality comparisons. So let's have a look at this capability approach. By the way, there are two versions of the theory. So it's very much analogous to Sen's Nobel-winning book on social choice, in which he would have a chapter written in verbal language and then a chapter written in math language. I'm not going to focus on the math stuff. I'm going to focus on the verbal stuff and only get to the math stuff when I want to show you some new results. But I'll do both versions of this. By the way, there's a guy, Ariel Rubinstein, was at the World Bank the other day and mentioned to me some unknown fact. People don't know it. He came to economics because of Sen's book on social choice. He read it and said, this is amazing, and went from being a mathematician to being a game theorist. I was very surprised to hear that, because that was exactly the reason I moved in from doing mathematics to doing economics. Okay, so the plan is to review capability approach, the origins, the definitions, implications, explore a couple of extensions, and discuss some applications. So this is all the lectures of everything today. Origins. Well, the capability approach can be traced back through the ages and through a lot of countries. Let's have a quick look around, and this is based on an approach given by Kaushik Basu and Luis Felipe Lopez Calva and a couple of other folks. Aristotle had this question, what should be the aim of public policy, essentially? Well, the answer given was to provide the conditions that enable people to have a flourishing life. So flourishing life, there are other names for this, Greek names as well, but it's also been used most recently in the context of the Gross National Happiness Index of Bhutan, where it isn't really gross national happiness, it's gross national flourishing. The happiness bit is a little too subjective. But if you look in what they're measuring, it's exactly, do you have the conditions for flourishing? These conditions help to produce the capabilities or the possibilities of functionings in certain human ways. Now, these certain human ways are left unspecified, but discussed. Examples such as nutrition, growth, in other material or biological ways. Then the other approach, the other side, which tends to be missed by economists, are the actual act and process of exercising choice, of reason, engaging in the public sphere. All that stuff is included as well. So what's the good? The good's where we're all able to flourish. Now notice the all. The all means that there's a kind of egalitarian twist to this, that everyone should be able to flourish. So a kind of egalitarianism in this space of capabilities is what this implies. Marx and Engels likewise had, yes, please.
Why do we assume that all people value participating when alive? Or why
They may not. We don't assume that.
So then we
These are examples.
Then we go back to
Sen would say, do not put, they're just examples. They're not meant for me to say to you, you must enjoy this.
Then we go back to the problem of using utility to measure well-being.
Mhm.
Because we can't compare utility across people. We can't measure, we
Mhm.
can't record it. And it's the same problem like here.
Is it really? Because, now let's think about it. If you have the capability, but don't take up the particular functioning, you may or may not be better off. In the sense that we're describing here, you are. And it's that sense, the option value, the chance to do if you indeed did have those particular preferences. That's where the action is coming from, the capabilities above the functioning. But you're right. I think that if there were no value of this, and if everyone perceived unanimously no value for something, why would we be evaluating it? It would be very paternalistic.
I would be a bit skeptical of those gross national index, whatever.
Why is that?
Uh,
How would it have been constructed, do you think?
I have no suggestion at this point
Yep.
of how it could be constructed, but I think it's a bit ad hoc. It might be politically driven.
What would make it less ad hoc if it was based on some kind of a theory? It's based on Buddhist principles. That's what it's based on. So, I mean, is there anything less ad hoc than aligning it to principles?
When we measure well-being, when we proxy well-being by consumption,
Yeah.
then we actually capture nutrition, as you state there.
Oh, you do?
Right?
Holy cow. So in India, what's been happening with consumption? We've seen tremendous increase in consumption over the last 20 years. Can anyone tell me what's going on with, let's say, childhood malnourishment? What does that look like? Is it like this, or like this? Egyptian, okay? It's like this. So yes, I suppose you're right that there's a presumption that we would have more nutrition as a result of having greater commodity bundles, but it's an empirical question, isn't it?
Your example about India is coming in because we proxy consumption as a scalar. If we decompose consumption in different,
You might be able to get to
then
it.
we are
I'm with you on that. So then what you're saying is that maybe we should not do consumption as an aggregate. Maybe for certain purposes we need to disaggregate and keep it disaggregated. I'd be with you on that. And it would be something quite similar, moving toward the aim of capability approach. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Has there been any construction of a dynamic utility function where you have
Yeah, this is really a great question, and it's something that I've been interested in a long time. Years ago, I was interested in the question of you know, where you eat one cereal in the morning, and the next day you eat the same cereal, and finally get tired of it. And so your preferences change You go out and get another cereal, and then you eat that for a while. And so this structure of preferences where it's continually changing, the reservation price for a particular product is dependent on your history, is, it's a great model for marketing purposes and for economics purposes. And it seems to be similar to the kinds of what other causes might be changing the relative weights of things is what you're asking. And I think that there are models out there. There are adaptive preference models. Yeah. So that's my particular model, right?
But also
demand for variety, right. And indeed, and in static substitutability, which is the interesting part, the distinction between over time and within space. So, yeah. So there are models of, I think this is where a lot of the action will be in over time, trying to understand what is it that gives you your preferences and all the social influences and so on. And it can be extremely important for your behavior. So let's continue.
So James, I have to increase your slate to 7
Please. Well, I know. Yes, kids in particular, the ones that we kill or the ones that we rape.
The political life, that's actually essential to Aristotle.
Mm-hmm.
You're not a citizen, you're out. And he justified slavery. Second, I don't even think you can talk about Aristotelian ideas without that component.
Yeah, it's in the back of my mind, I agree.
It's a civic animal, and so
Mm-hmm.
the main thing was egalitarian Aristotle didn't sit comfortably.
No, and indeed that's true. And I think that Sen also tends to go in that direction on occasion. Martha Nussbaum goes against what you're saying in other occasions, is more willing to say Aristotle and draw from it as a source of the values for capability approach.
Yeah, I agree on the capability.
Yeah. Okay. So, Marx and Engels. Also, it's parallel stuff. Yeah?
I was going to ask an issue that I guess came up yesterday before we got through. How do you make trade-offs between providing different capabilities if you're a public policy maker?
Bloody hard. This is, we see this in the exercise, and why I'm presenting to you today the exercise of constructing poverty measures that are in use. Because the way that people have done this is to establish, public policy groups who, take into account all the political discussion. They know the key variables that are salient in public policy terms at this moment. They, in Colombia, who constructed a multidimensional poverty index based on essentially the capability approach, looked at housing as being one of their key issues, and jobs as being a second key issue. They include that there, and then they explicitly value the deprivations in one versus deprivations in the other. They arrive at a decision. It's not a perfect decision, but it's a way forward, and it beats ignoring it and just talking about consumption. So how do you do it? It's tough. Sen never has an explicit solution to that question. He says one can value, and this should be with all the appropriate inputs of the political arena and technology as well. It may be
Value a capability, though, not a functioning.
Capability is what we'll talk about. The extra value from a capability is able to be valued, but let's not talk about that here. I'm speaking of functioning first.
Right, that's what it sounded.
Yeah. Functioning is at least something you have a hope of implementing given current data. Capability typically is just hard to do absolutely right. And we'll talk about that in a second. Okay, so Marx and Engels. They divide a commendable human life. Material biological needs are satisfied. Human needs, again, to exercise reasoning are satisfied. All this corresponds to functionings. A liberated society requires freedom in both spheres, enhanced opportunities in material dimensions, and in freedom to choose. that corresponds to capabilities. The freedom to, in a positive sense, is being expressed here rather than freedom from, which is the usual freedom that we think about in philosophical circles. Smith, likewise, in a really interesting discussion in Wealth of Nations, he was considering commodity taxation, and so he needed to describe what a necessary was and what a luxury was for the purposes of who should we tax and who should get the tax more. The person who has the ability to pay should be taxed more, according to what he says. But in this quote, we get into an idea that the social values are really important. The social goods are really important. So by necessaries, I understand not only the commodities, which are indispensably necessary for the support of life, but whatever the custom of the country renders it indecent for creditable persons, even of the lowest order, to be without. A linen shirt, and this is the linen shirt quote, for example, is strictly speaking not a necessary of life. The Greeks and Romans lived, I suppose, very comfortably, even though they had no linen, but in the present times, through the greater part of Europe, a creditable day laborer would be ashamed to appear in public without a linen shirt, the want of which would be supposed to denote the disgraceful degree of poverty with which it is presumed no one can well fall without extreme bad conduct. So a linen shirt in England, what is it elsewhere? Does it vary elsewhere? Maybe these are the socially or culturally defined capabilities that are needed. And as they change from society to society, maybe the cost of getting these things is more or less. Therefore, you have a poverty line in income space that varies relatively, and a poverty line that is staying fixed in a capability space. That's the idea. It goes on with some more discussion about France. I love the discussion of France. In France, they are necessities, these are shoes, neither to men or women. The lowest rank of both sexes appearing there publicly without any discredit, sometimes in wooden shoes, sometimes barefooted. Under necessaries, therefore, I comprehend not only those things which nature, but those things which established rules of decency have rendered necessary to the lowest rank of people. So the whole point here is just to get thinking about what constitutes a capability and where is it from. This is a socially determined capability or functioning. If commodities are instrumental, what are the ends? Human functionings, according to Smith. These include the basic ones, but also these social interaction, dignity, participation in the life of the community. And as I mentioned, it has an impact on how you envision setting cutoffs for measuring poverty. Sans poor, relatively speaking, is where this was done and noticed first, citing this quote. I will mention that this quote was once again cited recently in a paper by Revalian, in which he was proposing a weekly relative poverty line. And in that case, there was a discussion of what it is that constitutes a poverty, how much should it go up with a standard of living. So he gave one argument as to how the elasticity should rise with the standard of living based on this quote. But it turns out if you went on and continued reading the quote, it contradicted precisely what was being proposed and the measure being offered. So it was quite an interesting OECD conference when that was pointed out. Okay, so origins really then go back very far, but where it's been translated from is the current and recent works of Sen. Equality of what, which talks about capabilities. Poor, relatively speaking, we just mentioned. Commodities and capabilities, a great simple presentation of all this stuff, highly accessible to economists. Inequality re-examined, summarized the work up until that time. And there was a lot of work that he'd been working on in various realms, inequality, poverty, talking about the Human Development Index, which came along at the 1990s. Summary of this work in the context particularly of inequality and poverty. And he's claimed that any theory of justice requires equality in something, and went through each one of the theories and saw the equality, the something in which equality was being required. You think about utilitarianism. What's equal in utilitarianism? What are we making equal? Anyone know? Welfare, in fact, it's marginal utility is what we're doing. And yours and mine and all of ours are made the same at the appropriate maximal allocation, say, of money among a bunch of people through the indirect utility function. The marginal utility would be, marginal welfare would be the same then. Okay? So this is what he pointed out, and he pointed out that each of the theories of justice has its own equalizing that is occurring. And he said it's therefore equality of what that matters. Not that you're equalizing, but it's equality of what. He went on to write a edited volume with Martha Nussbaum on the quality of life. And this was an outcome of the wider World Institute for Development Economic Research project, which brought together philosophers and economists. And then the real magnum opus, I think this is the one that I would always read and suggest for reading. It's trying to define what is meant by development. Now, this is international development, not necessarily individual development, but development as freedom. The freedom to achieve, the freedom to progress. The Idea of Justice is one of his more, well, it's a previous book, besides he just came out with a new book with Jean Drèze, which goes beyond the capability approach to discuss principles of justice and processes, and I won't talk about that here. In fact, during all this philosophical discussion, it's all being motivated by policy and by empirics. In almost every one of his books, he pulls out salient data and salient concepts from philosophy to support or even critique his own view. So in the 1970s, there was the basic needs approach, and so much of what he's talking about sounds like basic needs, but the basic needs approach didn't quite have the agency of individuals helping themselves. It was more like, oh, you don't have enough basic needs, here we are. So Sen incorporated that second aspect, the freedom, as a central part of the process. 1980s, of course, with Thatcher. I was in England for a good part of the time. Over here we had Ronald Reagan, so there was a tilt in the way the conception was of the good, and growth became the good, and Sen's response was to say that growth should be people-based or focused on human ends, reflective of what we had just talked about in the discussion. And then in the 1990s, there was production of the annual Human Development Report, each one thematic, describing some way in which human ends are being affected over time. Nussbaum also had many papers on capability approach. I won't go into them here. Many other authors as well. Nussbaum in particular has a list of categories of capabilities, if you're interested. This list is more or less definitive according to what she said. She thought it would change over time. It hasn't changed that much over time. Sen, on the other hand, never produced a list and says he never will, and gave all kinds of good reasons about flexibility of his theory. People have critiqued Sen, saying that, look, this is an unfinished theory. You really haven't made this so that it can be applied or useful for anything. And he's ignored it. And in fact, empirically, more people have used this approach now than a whole lot of other approaches. So empirically, in a sense, he's really been successful. Yes, go ahead.
This may be taking a step back, but
that's all right.
when we talk about something like participating in the political life or
Yeah.
social, participating in the society.
Right, community.
Taking the society or political life as given, or are those up for criticism as well?
Good question. Yes, I mean, in fact, how
It's like the social custom for that, everyone has to have a gold watch.
or think of the extreme case over here, which the social custom is that we can participate, but they can't, and that's just the right and the good. It's all up for criticism, no doubt. But of course, in conceptions of the good may not include the criticism within them and may need to be critiqued from the outside as well. So that's a great question. Yeah, we saw the kind of problems with the just focusing yourself on yourselves and your customary way of doing things. Yes, it's entirely reasonable that we don't include women in the process of the political life in our region. Of course, it makes absolute sense. So, good question. Yeah. Do you have an implication of that, by the way? Okay, continuing. Yes, sure, if you wish. Yep.
Are there other claims besides Nussbaum? So you would
Hmm. I don't know. You tell me. Mm-hmm. I think that I would agree with that. Well, in fact, it is true that there are counterexamples to all of these, but yes, let's not go to the extreme.
So I guess the question is, and I understand what you said backs away, I'm just asking, in what sense does universality? There was needs in the discussion yesterday, was no exactly claiming universality, and what's narrow effect
As with anything, the narrower the set, the more, the greater the comparability and the greater agreement that you have about the set. That's, a typical intersection approach for different groups of people thinking about different things. I can't go any further than to say that Sen simply will not agree to state that this is a universal for everyone. He will say it's his perception and through the and. Mm-hmm. Yep. But what's great about it is that it isn't an outcome. Yeah, yeah.
I want to be a Jamaican, I want to be a Pakistani, I want to be a,
yeah.
Zimbabwean. Each of these is different because of different opportunities.
Yep.
So it kind of violates the, isn't there a quest for universality?
But it's that process, the quest for universality and the idea of what is the good being reconstructed and discussed. That's what Sen is all about. It's the process. It's not the end. This is an end. This is saying, here it is, it's done. He says it's a work in progress. That's what I believe Sen's approach would be on this. No. You take the best that you have now. No. Look, I mean.
So in Pakistan, they're going through the process of making Bangladesh or not, say, for example.
Yeah.
So, okay, that may be true, all that, but then how do I compare Pakistan and Bangladesh?
Yeah. Well, we can compare them based on our own values, can't we? The question is, if what we're finding would in fact impact the people in Pakistan to think about it and become disgruntled enough to make sure things work. And Sen has that as the process of change. It's either democratic or argumentative, or it's public discourse. I think it's great for a group of people to get together and think of a core set. I think it's entirely fine, and to defend that core set. I think it's very important, and to convince others that this is a core set for the basis of undertaking public policy. I'll do that. I'll join you on that. No. 3 of us are good enough. Yeah. No, I get your point, and there are implementation questions. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, so this is the Sen distinction, the idea of justice. Let's not go for the ideal, let's go for the better. And that's mm-hmm. They very well could, but his point, and an important point in the book, is that even with different cultural points of view, even with different even with everything, there may be points of agreement. We should work on those points of agreement, at the very least. No. There are outcomes, I suppose, yes, along the way. But again, talking about this is temporary statics and then a process.
I was going to say it's also worth pointing out that comparing income across societies is difficult too.
It surely is.
We're complaining about this in international comparisons. It's not easy to make international comparisons. That's also
No. PPP is perfect.
In some sense, I think I can start talking about comparing big names. It's true, I mean, there's labor cost and family cost, but I can talk about what does it cost to buy a hamburger in Malawi?
And you'd get the best estimate of the cost to buy a hamburger across the world as a result of that. You'd do a great job.
Somebody
does. Yeah, it does have meaning. Can you have price? This is one of the big questions from the theory. Is there a way to price out each individual capability? And the answer is hell no. There's too many other things that are feeding into the capability that you're not pricing. Okay? I mean, all those years of investments, they're either there or they aren't. That's the whole question. Can you really recover from what wasn't invested at an early age? No. So what's the price? Infinite. Okay, so let's put infinite in there. Is there a problem with what I just said? Wait, but listen to your own work, which says that I don't need to. You know what I'm saying, guys, right? I mean, okay, I would be willing to try to do that. I have no problems with trying to do it. At that time, and then of course now it's infinite.
Yeah, well, it could be, but it could also be some finite object.
Mm-hmm.
So I agree, there's 3 cases where it wouldn't be well defined.
Yeah.
But there'd be a lot of cases where it would be.
And that should feed into the discussion, and feed into the values, and feed into the public policy. But the fact is by saying that income is sacrosanct, and saying there's no contention, that's a false statement. Because there's a whole lot of contention about the use of income in poverty statistics and consumption in poverty statistics. I can tell you the World Bank data, there are 1,000 ways that I could critique it. I tend not to because I think it's wonderful we have collected such wonderful data on consumption and income and have incorporated all of the information over time and space and learned a hell of a lot. But maybe there's room for supplementing it with considerations like this. Okay? All right. Okay, so let's just do a verbal description of this approach. What is it? Sense capability approach. At its basis, it's a moral or an evaluative or a normative framework that proposes that social arrangements should be primarily evaluated according to the extent of freedom people have to promote or achieve functionings they value. Whew. What a mouthful. But that's what his theory, his approach is all about. In most of Sen's writings, the language is tough. It's dense. The definitions you have to cull through to see what the heck is going on. Why is that word being used at that moment? And so that's part of what the discussion is here, being able to add substance to the words. Okay? Capability, the various combinations of functionings, the beings and doings that the person can achieve. Yes, go ahead, I'll cut it right in the middle of it. Please do. Yep.
So, in my view, one of the reasons to not have a universal list is that then we stop thinking about what is important for specific people in a specific environment.
Yeah.
So, I've done some impact evaluation in Tanzania,
Mm-hmm.
and one of the things we found was that people really dislike working as casual labor. So they would take an income cut when they can afford not to do casual labor and weed other people's fields. And so when you think about it, if you compare income across families, then you'll find that some poorer families are actually better off because they can afford not to work for others, which
Got
is
it.
really
And so in their set of options was the point, the functioning, that they could be working,
yeah,
but they chose not to work for others.
exactly. And so and
They're better off.
I mean, that's just a small example from one application, but I think if you put down a universal list, the problem is that we have many other things to think about as economists. So we'll just take that list as given and stop thinking about the specific place that we're in.
I think that aligns very closely with Sen's idea of deliberation, of reflection, of having reason to value, that type of thought that goes into the having reason to value.
Because Sen because the utility evaluations would be very dependent. So the poor person may not want some really affluent, some commodity, an affluent person, and that person has no experience of it and may not even conceive in some.
Another.
And so the idea was to give that person, I thought, compare people across very different situations. So for example, a woman may feel that certain options are not available to her in a given society. And then the function is that there's a larger set of options that she may not want. So in that sense, I thought it was
So it's interesting. That's a reversal then, because here's a situation where the person doesn't want, but there may be good reason for that person to want. There may be value for that person in wanting this. And so,
say that, I started to feel for something universal. Actually, everybody wants a Buick or whatever.
no, they don't.
So that's the point.
Yeah.
You want to get rid of this idea.
Well, it's,
I don't want to drag you down.
no, it's fine. You're not dragging me down. You're just taking my time. It's all right. I don't mind. I have plenty of that. No, the point is that, yeah. So I think we have a good handle on this issue. It's something which is not absolutely clear. There's no fixed answer. You have to defend, argue on the case. And in fact, in each public policy situation, you may have to argue the case. That's what Sen would say. Now, if it's the right way, I don't know. Who knows? It gets kind of tedious if you just have to be arguing every time. But you're right. The goal is for toward universal, but recognizing. Yeah, could have been. It was behavior based on someone's weighing of options. No, but Sen would have said the set is what we want to look at, and the set was obviously bigger for this person than for the other person who's forced to work. Let's just look at the two choices. You have a choice not to work, a choice to work, versus a choice.
How do I define the set and not somebody in the world? I mean, where do I stick at the set?
Mm-hmm.
Put what's in there that has no value.
Depends on the circumstance.
I think that's the question. What's in the commodity box
Yep.
that we're going to value, right? So
Yep.
That seems to kind of somewhere sneaking in the background is a preference. And I would guess it's universal preference. You're saying we can all agree on it. Maybe I don't agree. Maybe I really think it's great to reject people who apply, HIV virus.
That's where the reason to value is coming in. I mean, it's just got to be there. The idea that you have a check based on reflection. Okay, it sounds gooey, but it's the only way forward.
That's called utility function. In the end, data you say utility function across different states. Anyway,
Okay, so I'll book.
but I would agree with it completely. Somehow you want to put some good, you don't want to put in a bunch of good things at all,
Mhm.
right? Nobody wants to get hit by a falling rock.
This will come in the discussion of freedom, because in the discussion of freedom, if you add an unambiguously crappy option, then your capability set, your set of alternatives is not any better. It has no more freedom. And it's exactly that issue on one hand, and then accounting for the additional good things.
But it has no more freedom because they don't value.
Because there's, and what it means not to value it, I agree. It can be a set of preferences. It can be. It can be a set of preferences. It can be informed by preferences, but not by one, but by a set of reasonable preferences. Interesting, huh? Yeah. Okay. I may not be able to answer it because it still is a subtle issue.
Kind of like philosophically, I'm having a hard time following it.
Yeah.
Like, whose thoughts on, I mean, who has the right to decide whether it's a reasonable value or not? Not to get like really
Not stated.
Not to get really political, but
Not stated.
on the choice of pro-choice versus pro-life.
Yep.
I mean, clearly people have really different values.
Yep.
There's the freedom to choose and the freedom from being around other people who make choices that you don't agree with.
Mhm.
So
In-
who counts in my set of people's values that I really care about?
Good question. I have no answer. Right? Because, again, in Sen's world, it's specific to the issue at hand. Who counts is those who count. It's sort of definitional, right? In fact, it becomes part of those who desire to have it count. And then the pressure is brought to bear, and that whole discussion of theories of how things can change have to be brought into the discussion. And Sen does it in many cases in his writings. But that's, you know, that's a fallback to saying, well, these people. You know, and there may be, you know, values which are not laden with the problems we're talking about, but then who am I to say so?
I mean, but then that in itself is sort of a capability, I would say, able to count.
Too many levels.
Sorry.
But I'm,
Able to count. Like,
yeah.
I imagine there are regimes in the world where women don't even get to be part of that.
exactly. No, that's right. Yep. And it's very similar again to the Greek problem. So this is another quote from his recent book. And then finally, Alkire has this nice statement: all formulations of capability have two parts, freedom and valuable beings and doings. Sen's contribution was to combine these sorts of things, these two together into one concept. So let's talk about functionings. The various things that a person may value and have reason to value doing or being. It's an intuitive concept. It's abstract, but in Sabina's work in participatory methods, you wouldn't believe how quickly groups of people seem to align on the ideas of this approach. Things that are intrinsically valuable to the person are crucial. It isn't just instrumental value. And so the theory requires a certain amount of intrinsically important importance in functionings. And the reason to value. And this is the great example of having reason. I have reason to value broccoli because it's healthy for me. It makes me grow and thrive. But I may hate broccoli, so I don't value it at all. But yet I have reason to value it. And of course it can go the other way as well. The whole point of this is to avoid the adaptive preference conundrum. On further reflection, I may not value something like killing people, even though initially I thought, hey, that might be fun. Okay, doings and beings, this is the functioning space, is the focal space of human lives. So an example of all this. Imagine you have a bike, okay? The bike is a resource. The resource gives you, potentially, you hope so, it gives you the ability to ride around. And therefore, if you ride around, you have that functioning. And if you enjoy riding around, you would get satisfaction from it, some utility value. The problem is, of course, that in this picture, that all of these things are disconnected from one another. You could have a bike but be disabled and not be able to ride the bike. Therefore, your hoped capability, your hoped ability to ride around wouldn't be there, because the transformation from the commodity, from the resource to the capability or functioning is different than your neighbor. Secondly, you might in fact not have this bicycle and not be able to get around and yet be as happy as possible. You're just ecstatic because you've adapted to your situation of not being able to get around. And even though it's drudgery and it's terrible, you still put on a good face of it, and in fact, you fool yourself. Example, of course, given by Sen frequently is food. And the ability to be nourished being the capability, being nourished, the extent to which you're nourished being the functioning, and then, of course, the pleasure therefrom. And he gives plenty of examples of different people that might be put into this framework. Maybe a day laborer working very hard and energetically, or someone who has 1 month left before she's giving birth, or a child or an elderly person. Suppose you start off with a pound of rice. That pound of rice will have a very different effect in terms of nourishment with each one of these persons. Perhaps the first two would need more and may not even be nourished, well nourished by this amount of rice, whereas kids and grandma might be doing just fine. So the distinction between this case is that you have different rates of conversion, different conversion factors between the underlying commodity out there and the capability and functionings. And of course, that can go backwards as well. People who are accustomed not to have food and are at the brink of famine, these people may very well have found a way of being satisfied with their situation nonetheless. And the utility level could be much higher than utility levels of people who are type A, want to get further. They have so much, but they don't have what they would like. Okay?
Well, that was a question follow up to this point. Like I heard there were studies done, that suggest that people in developing countries might be happier than people in developing
Yes,
countries.
exactly the point.
And so maybe the part of it comes from like the social interaction, because
Agreed.
even inside like let's say a developed country, it is different somewhere in the countryside, right? Tighter family relationships and
Absolutely.
going around with neighbors, and it's a much better community
Yes.
than in a city that everybody has everything, like resources,
Yes.
everything they want to, but the social interaction is not quite full,
So why is it that Hispanics in the US are so healthy? One hypothesis. Lots of very interesting examples of this in the impact on health. Yes, it is the case that there are hidden features that we need to think of, and we can't just dismiss the possibility that the utility level is reflective of other good things that we're not realizing in our discussion right now, but upon further examination and analysis indeed reveal themselves. But the problem here, and what Sen is pointing out, is that utility by itself surely gives no indication at all as to the conditions of the person, as to whether they're malnourished, whether they're starving, whether they're on the brink, or whether they're doing exceptionally well in terms of the kinds of material goods that would make them thrive. Now this is a schematic that gets into all the other impacts that you might imagine on each one of these stages. So this is really a schematic of the capability approach. You may have seen one that's in other sources, which are a little bit simpler. This one is trying to take into account not just the standard movement across the board from means to achieve, including non-market production, market production, income, transfers in kind. So this is the real sort of income, then purchasing of goods and services, and of course we're ignoring other sorts of things that are potentially going on. But let's just say goods and services are purchased with all this stuff. And then there are conversion factors that we've discussed are very different across people. They're converted into capabilities, and then people have choice. From that choice, they actually find a functioning which is achieved from the set of capability. The achieved functionings then is on the right-hand side, and of course you could go to the next step to utility, but we don't. It isn't on this graph, but it should be for generic purposes. And choice is impacted by personal history and lots of other things. Also influenced by society. Social institutions impact what you're capable of. All these social and environmental factors impact the capability set, and also your ability to convert. If you have little walkways that are smooth, then you may be able to actually roll into a building, as opposed to not have access to a building if you are disabled and must use a wheelchair. That's provided by society as opposed to being provided by yourself. Yes?
But the social context does not affect the non-market and market?
Well, the problem is that with all such diagrams, you focus on arrows that you're interested in, but clearly everyone could define impacts along the way. The transfers in kind, obviously it's going to be, transfers in kind have to be a socially determined part of the issue, although it could be, other types of transfers that are coming from friends. It could be coming from other organizations. So, yeah, this is just pointing at some of the main influences, and Ingrid Robin's took it a step further than Sen, and I think it takes it a step in a good way. Yeah.
Should I think that the bigger capability set is better? I don't know why.
Now that's a good question. The measurement of freedom, right? And what does it mean? And is to what extent is it better? There are two lines of argument, obviously. If the things are valuable and meaningful to people, and it doesn't disturb their ability to make that choice, which it could, of course. Have you ever been faced with all the different nonsensical consumer goods? You know, you're trying to buy a type of frozen pizza, and there's like 30 million of them. You're going, oh, which frozen pizza? And you waste your time. Okay, ruling that out, then the assumption here, which could be made explicit, a monotonicity assumption, strict monotonicity, would be that more is better.
But I mean, there's still a problem about you mentioning that developing country, if you ask people, you feel happy. It's likely that they feel happy because you ask them, okay, are you happy? They say yes, happy. They may have very much smaller set of capabilities.
Yes.
They don't, I think people in Bhutan may have maybe some know, but some may not even know it's Google.
Mm.
I mean,
And that, are you saying that's good or bad? I'm sorry, I was trying to, that they don't know Google is good or bad?
I don't know.
Yeah.
What it means, like they have smaller set than people.
Yes. But the thing is, we must remember that the set that's being identified is not in terms of goods. It's not in terms of commodities or the kinds of things that we tend to associate with well-being, but instead are beings and doings. And if the person in Bhutan is provided with an ability to go across town in a bus, then that person's hell of a lot better off in terms of mobility than the person who lives in Nashville, Tennessee, and is trying to have a job at the other end of town because there's no bus service. You got to buy a car. So there's a difference. So you know, it can be, even where you have very bad services being provided, a very bad service might be very important and be able to create a strong value for it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. Well, yeah.
I'm not sure if that's can reconcile.
So in the end of the day, we care about happiness or well-being, which is the outcome of that production function, and not about the capability set itself.
I don't know. I mean,
So that in the end of the day, we go back to measuring well-being by utility. But
Of course you can't do that. So the question is, what do you do that's closest to utility without being utility? And this is the attempt. Yeah. So now, yes?
at some point, I think it would be very useful to simply consider this as a very different kind.
Okay, please.
Well, no, but just to consider some alternative issues. Think about the old group coefficient of welfare and utilization.
Uh-huh.
That was an idea of trying to come up with a measure of production possibility set. Or even this notion that in fact efficiency value is actually efficiency frontiers for companies.
Yeah.
Firms, there was a big literature, you know.
So can we estimate capability sets in a rigorous fashion?
That would be it. But basically, instead of saying I want to have to look at a particular point, I want to simply estimate. Why not this is the frontier? So it becomes like a frontier production function. And then I can stop.
With structure, I would agree.
Right.
Yeah, with enough structure.
With enough structure.
There's some,
Include inputs and social inputs and include things like, you know, there would be additional considerations that, Farrell, you have this point, right? And so the point is it's very similar. And de Bruy's coefficient,
Yep.
you know, this back in his old theory of value, has exactly, he's trying to come up with some measure of how big a set was.
And
relative to
so the kinds of capabilities you're looking at might be amenable to it. And that's the interesting point. In fact, if you can locate specific capabilities that are relevant for your study,
But it might be that
and
even with my political freedom,
Yeah.
I say, well, I have political freedom. You know,
Wow.
they look at Sen's new book on India.
yeah, I have. Yeah.
So you may have a lot of political freedom, but you may have a huge amount of inefficiency.
Yep.
Democracy can lead easily to corruption and lead to bribery.
Yep.
But that's very amenable to a production possibility set. I have more votes. I allow people to vote. I allow them to politics. I allow people to set up bureaucracy.
Mhm.
Corrupt and inefficient, but nonetheless they
You
get
st-
votes. So you vote once a year, twice a year, whatever they vote, you feel happy or whatever. trade-off to the other good. That's, all this is in principle. Isn't it? I mean, again, as long as we have the notion that I know that more of it is better than less,
Yep.
that's your monotheistic sense. Isn't that enough to say I just want to get production up and this one?
Is it enough?
To define capability. One set is more capable than the other because
I mean,
a larger space.
the problem is that so many capabilities are discrete, are clunky, are qualitative, are not amenable.
The integer value.
There'd be, and even integer value is a construct that's above the notion of capability. If you look at each one of these discussions, self-reported health, let's take that for example. It's not a capability, but I'm just trying to give it as an ordinal variable. With an ordinal variable, you can assign numbers, but those numbers mean nothing. And if you take them as meaning anything at all besides placeholders, you're out of luck. So Angus Deaton's done this, right? Where he's assigned numbers and got some really great results, but those results don't hold up. If you change the numbers in a coherent way that's monotonic to his original scaling, the results go away. So you don't want to do that. And so to the extent that you have underlying capabilities that are qualitative in nature, that are not amenable to unique representation, unique is the important point, representation by a numerical index, there are problems that have to be resolved. Yeah, and I'll give me 2 seconds, I'll show you an approach.
Still imagine more versus less.
Agreed. Yeah.
And I could think of it
So maybe do a ranking.
these guys would think about what these concave functions were. Okay, we want to anyway, I don't want to slow you down.
Well, you are, but that's fine. I'm used to it, it's great.
Okay, so that's one question. The second question is you must face all the time. So at some point I'd be curious if you address it.
Yeah,
Because this has a real, if you put your old, the diagram you had up a minute
yeah,
ago,
yeah.
that's
Imagine.
very similar to think of the household production model. With that.
Sure.
So you have like the Z goods. Z
Yeah.
goods would be things like your capacities. You have the frontier set in terms of the Z. You have the final consumption. So we're going to do the efficiency frontier in terms of the Z goods. Huge literature. Bob Pollock, you know the literature.
Yep. So it seems to me that there are margins in which the discussion can move forward on capabilities and other margins where there are challenges. And the fact is, how do we find out which and work forward appropriately? That's the question. Yep. And what are, in fact, one of the big questions is what are these trade-offs, both on a production side and on a, evaluation side? Big question. Could be done.
You could argue that what's the cost of democracy?
Mm-hmm.
Estimated that's the kill. I didn't say I believe the estimate, but what I'm saying is that there are estimates presented, and that would be possible. So you could dispute the evidence, but it's not like somebody's in principle, right? Yes, what's the effect of democracy?
Mm-hmm.
The debate out on China versus India right now. Raging issue.
It is a raging issue, I agree, yeah. The problem is that the word democracy, is that really what you're measuring, or is it all the other things that are out there? And that's a huge question. I agree you can talk about it and you can reason through it and try and convince others. Okay, so where the hell was I? All right. Other questions before I try and find where I was? Anyone? Okay, great. Okay, so yes. So one of the main points of all of this is that it's not a paper freedom. We're talking about a real freedom here. So we go back to the question that I guess I was getting into was, what is freedom in this context? Because freedom is the size, if you will, or the extent of your capabilities in this context. The real opportunity we have to accomplish that which we want to, that we value. So it's authentic self-direction. This is the point. You are the agent as well as being the person doing valuing. It's very important that that part also shows up in the discussion, agency as well as the options. So as I said, this isn't a paper freedom. It's something that has to be able to be implemented to see the extra advantage received. It's not maximization of choice with regard to quality and people's values. In fact, as we said before, if you have a lot of extra choices, it may not be valuable at all because you're confused and it takes forever to figure out what's up. And by the way, in Sen's notion, it's not necessarily that which is under my control, my direct control, but it's more broad notions of control or agency. So it could be individuals, groups, states, increasing capabilities through public action. So freedom has two aspects, one that Sen calls the opportunity aspect, which is the real opportunity to achieve valued functionings selected from among various options, and the other is this sort of process of that approach, the ability to act on behalf of what matters, agency. These are the institutions, of course individuals as well, movements, democratic practice as well as the agency of an individual. So a person has some control of this, and this is called agency, what a person is free to do and achieve in pursuit of whatever goals they have. Someone who acts and brings about change in these achievements will be judged in terms of her own values and objectives. Whether or not we assess them in terms, well, that's irrelevant. Agency is the person's ability to act on what they value and have reason to value. So it's the ability to act on behalf of this. And this is a really interesting quote from Jean Drèze and Amartya Sen. The approach is essentially people-centered, which puts human agency rather than organizations such as markets or governments at the center of the stage because you evaluate it in terms of individuals, even though there's a very important, crucial social role in the issue. Crucial role of social opportunities is to expand the realm of human agency and freedom, both as an end in itself as a means of future expansion of freedom. The word social and the expression social opportunity is a useful reminder not to view individuals and their opportunities in isolated terms. The options depend greatly on relations with others, which I'll return to in a second, and on what the state and other institutions do. We should be particularly concerned with those opportunities that are strongly influenced by social circumstances and public policy, hence might have great impact on people's capabilities with very modest investments in, from the government. It sounds like it, doesn't it? Yeah, if we can. Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. No. Oh, okay. Yeah, I took it that way, of course. No, he would say that there are ways of approaching that include the options of trying to measure things in ways that would be amenable to traditional economic analysis. There are, in particular, a kind of equivalent scale, let's say, where you take, let's take an individual who's disabled. You might be able to construct equivalent scales and measure things in income space still. There might be possibilities in that direction. And once you know, however, you have all the empirical information that makes sense in terms of the conversion process, then you may be able to go that next step. That's the problem, though, is that do we have all those data? Are people studying them yet? And this is your cue, guys. There's a lot of room for studying the kinds of interactions, the conversions. Okay, well, let's go on. There's some misunderstandings of Sen's approach, and I'll just mention them because it's interesting to mention the misunderstandings so that you can see whether you are doing just that. The discussion obviously goes beyond health and education, even though those are very important parts of it, and in fact are put in terms of the Human Development Index. What time are we at? Should we finish soon? 5 minutes, okay. Well, I think I'll get to 2 parts of my lecture. Great. That's okay? Good. It's deliberately incomplete in that it may be the case that you don't make any decisions. There may be competing values that you just can't move forward on. Based on individualism, but not in a sense that you're focusing only on the individual as end all and be all, but as an individual as the evaluation taking place. But action can take place in collectives as well, hence the distinction between ethical versus methodological. And not all multidimensional analyses are motivated or consistent with capability analysis. A lot of people don't consider freedom. They look at functionings, and I've done the same. They don't look at intrinsic value. They don't look at capabilities. They don't, in fact, incorporate discussions of how processes occur, like public debate. It's really hard to measure freedom. And it's also hard to figure out what the counterfactual options were that you didn't take. Now, of course, there's a lot of discussion about that in the literature of inference. So there may be some interesting options open to figuring out that set, as you point out. Capability approach. Formalization, I won't talk much about the formalities. This is a picture of the discussion I believe Stephen had presented, which is vector of commodities, vector of characteristics a la Lancaster or Gorman. Fi is that conversion function. It could be a choice of an individual. In the way I'm putting it here, it's just given. The vector of functionings is Bi, and it's a function of, see, the conversion of the characteristics associated with the bundle of commodities in this simplified model. And Xi is the set of vectors of commodities that are feasible for I. So you might have a bunch of different potential vectors you could buy as given by a budget set. Qi then would be the translation of that into capability, into functioning space, hence into capability. So Qi is a capability set or the capability. So it's a set of all BIs, or functioning vectors, which are able to be sourced out in the feasible set of bundles. So that's one way of formalizing it, and I will tell you that there are many other ways of formalizing it. So it depends on the circumstances as to what you're interested in capturing in the model, as with any economic or otherwise model. Also motivates looking at interesting empirical issues. I was just saying before, the discussion of interactions across dimension. And in fact, I had a paper a few years ago which was motivated by a comment by Bert Weisbrod, who you must know from, was he there at Wisconsin when you, oh, he had gone. So the first paper, or the second paper I ever published was a note on Bert Weisbrod's, one of his papers. So we were at a meeting at a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and talking about health and education, and I said, I'm really interested in this margin between the two. And he said, yeah, I've always wondered, and put it this way, would $1 more spent on education have a bigger impact on health than $1 more spent on health? And so I took this question and posed it to my graduate student, and after a long time, it became a thesis on Head Start, because Head Start, early education program, and the impacts he was exploring was adult health impacts. So finally was published talking about smoking behavior, that Head Start apparently had the impact of bringing smoking behavior, bringing the amount of smoking down earlier, because everyone in the poor group of Head Start at that day and age would be smoking. It's just a matter of when they quit. And it was an earlier quitting. The only way we could explain this using the data was to invoke some of Jim's work, and thankfully the referee bought it. Practical considerations. Sen suggested that his capability approach could be applied to all kinds of situations to evaluate circumstances, but he was not at all clear how to do so. So after the break, and I'm going to quit right now because it's a neat break to stop. After the break, we'll start again on the practical considerations. I'll talk about it, and then I'll see what else I'm going to cover because I'm rapidly changing my gears. See you in a second.